Hello, I'm Muriel, and I love true crime.
I'm Nick, and I am not a fan.
Thank you for joining us. Each week, I force Nick to listen to me tell him a story of a true crime. Welcome to Muriel's Murders. All right, folks, we're back in the saddle. This is the first story in a 3-part series we put together specifically for Halloween.
Yes.
First off, this whole monstrosity was inspired by a request from listener Maria and the kids.
Yes. Hello, kids.
This is our stab at a creepy, preteen-friendly podcast. However, after many hours of writing and editing, we realized this may be both too scary for kids and too weird for the true crime folks. We may have made something that truly has no demographic, but what's done is done.
We're attempting a PG/PG-13 family-friendly ordeal.
Also, it's historical.
Something for nobody.
We took 3 of the weirdest Brothers Grimm fairy tales we could find, gave them a true crime treatment, and then Nick designed a maximalist over-the-top soundscape for each piece.
It was my first attempt at trying to do something akin to a radio play.
Look at us go. Well, you did that for Eva Koo, and it was really great. So
This
I can't
is
wait to hear
way
this.
more sound effecty than the Eva Koo episode.
Okay, well, don't say it like it's a bad thing. All right, so Nick, what do you know about the Brothers Grimm?
I think they were brothers, okay? From the old times, I don't know, Europe thing. They were old-timey Europe people, like
the old
medieval.
times Europe thing.
They were like old-timey European people who wrote fairy tales that were meant for children, but they were all really weird and crazy and scary and violent.
All right, so we're going to debunk some of that stuff.
Okay.
Okay, because I kind of had the same feeling, and then when I started researching it, I was like, oh, that's interesting. So first off, just to start, do you know which popular stories the Grimm brothers brought us?
No, definitely not.
So we're talking Cinderella, Snow White, Little Red Riding Hood, Hansel and Gretel, Rapunzel.
They came up with all of those?
Yeah.
Those are like the greatest hits.
Yeah, and there's a lot more than that. That's just kind of like some of the most famous ones. But they didn't actually write those stories. They collected them. The Brothers Grimm were actually a pair of German folklorists and linguists from the 1800s. So yes, they were actually brothers, and they were more academics. So they collected hundreds of German stories that up until then had only been passed down orally. So they hadn't been written. So the fairy tale collection was a way of preserving old-timey German culture and morals and things like that.
That is so cool.
So while the stories have children in them, they weren't ever necessarily meant for kids. Kids could listen to them, but the stories were more about basically the difficult conditions that these guys were living in and like the natural morals that were emerging in the German culture at a certain time.
Okay.
And the timeline of this is kind of interesting because they collected stories from Germans in the 1800s, and these stories were very old at the time. They didn't have a means of figuring out how old they actually were. But really recently, there was a study published in a scientific journal called Royal Society Open Science that suggested that some of these tales that are still well known today are actually thousands of years old. So they were feeling like they were preserving like the German version of these stories, but some of these stories, could be tracked to oral traditions going back thousands of years.
To all different types of cultures.
Right.
Cool.
Like the origins of Jack and the Beanstalk and Beauty and the Beast look like they could be up to 4,000 years old based on this study, which is old.
Yeah, that's so cool.
And for our series on Halloween, we did not go with the greatest hits of the Grimm brothers.
Ooh, Muriel's bringing you the Grimm brothers B-sides.
We decided to retell some of the stranger, not safe for work-ish tales.
Okay, but it's not SF NSFW, Muriel. This is family friendly.
Well, I'm not swearing, but we'll get into that, okay?
Okay, all right.
So we used the 1987 translation of The Complete Fairy Tales of the Brothers Grimm by Jack Zipes, who's a big scholar within the Grimm community.
Okay.
I preserved the original dialogue, the structure, and the plot points, but I had a bunch of fun giving it some Muriel's murder stank, a little treatment.
Right. This is, you rewrote these stories for your voice.
Right, but we kept all of the plot points. So I didn't invent anything except for maybe motivation behind the characters. But the actual plot points are all the same.
Please keep in mind when Muriel is saying we, she's either deflecting responsibility or being very kind and including me.
I'm not. Those are both very...
Muriel did all of this on her own. I have no idea what she's about to say.
Nick added a bunch of insane sound effects and music. I have no idea how to rate these episodes for kids. There's no swearing and no sex, but there's lots of beheadings, stepmother crushings, playing with corpses, etc., etc. So I think if you want to play it for your kid, listen to it first. Don't take my word for it. I'm generally inappropriate. I found this quote from the Brothers Grimm about whether or not Grimm's tales are appropriate for children in the preface of one of their books that was translated by Jack Zipes, which I felt was an appropriate warning, not only for like whether or not this is appropriate for kids, but like true crime in general and whether or not, you know, this is something you'd like to be listening to. Right?
Wonderful.
I just liked it. So in addressing the question of whether or not to put the book into the hands of children, the brothers said, quote, that concern might be legitimate in certain cases, and then one can easily make selections. On the whole, it is certainly not necessary. Nature itself provides our best evidence, for it has allowed these and those flowers and leaves to grow in their own colors and shapes. If they are not beneficial for any person or personal needs, something that the flowers and leaves are unaware of, then that person can walk right by them. But the individual cannot demand that they be colored and cut according to his or her needs. Or, in other words, rain and dew provide a benefit for everything on earth. Whoever is afraid to put plants outside because they might be too delicate and could be harmed and would rather water them inside cannot demand to put an end to the rain and dew.
For those of us who don't understand what that means on any level, give us a quick little interpretation, please, Muriel.
They just said we're not going to make these tales for kids, right? Like we get that you might not like how violent they are, but they exist. And for the Grimm brothers, it was really important to preserve the culture and less important to make them more digestible for kids. And so at the beginning of this book called Fairy Tales, which really these are more like folklore pieces, they say, you know, hey, man, these seem like they're kid friendly. There's kids in them, right? They have kind of childlike metaphors and mermaids and like different things like that, right? But we're not going to be too worried about whether or not it's too scary for your kid. It is what it is, right? We're not going to make them, you know, less scary to make them more palatable. And over time, Disney did that and everything's fine.
So, Maria, you requested something for your kids. We tried and it landed on this.
So here we go. And with that, we bring you a story of a relentless monster. Grimm Tale number 108, Hans, My Hedgehog. Story starts with a rich farmer. This guy is married. He has lots of land and money. He's a very comfortable guy, comfortable life. The only thing is he has no kids, which is crushing and depressing for him. And to top it all off, he pretty much lived in a town full of jerks. For instance, when he'd leave his farm to get something cool in town or groceries or something, all the other farmers would mercilessly tease him for being childless. And the farmer would hold his head up, maybe try to get in his own zingers, like, yeah, well, I may not be rich in children, but at least I'm rich in grain, Carl, or whatever. But the teasing got under his skin. And one day, the farmer snapped. After a particularly bad teasing in town, the farmer returned home red-faced. He stood in the kitchen with his wife and he shouted to God and the ceiling and the universe, I want to have a child, even if it's a hedgehog. Shortly afterwards, the farmer's wife became pregnant. And the wife may have had a feeling something was up, but the farmer was pretty optimistic. He was going to be a father, and he would finally be able to tell the other farmers to shove it in their pie hole. When the big day came, the farmer's wife went into labor. There were tears of joy and celebration, anticipation and pacing of the hallways, and finally, the moment of a lifetime. The farmer's wife gave birth to a son in the shape of a tiny hedgehog with human legs.
How many legs? 2 or 4?
2 human legs. So he would stand upright, but the rest of him was a hedgehog.
Aren't hedgehogs very spiky?
And very small. Yes. So
it's a tiny little spiky hedgehog.
Yes. So the farmer's wife looked down at the hedgehog and looked up at her husband and spoke from her heart. You see how you cursed us? And the farmer knew she was right. But there was nothing to say. There was nothing they could do about it now. No amount of yelling, regret, or blame could change the fact that his mouth wrote a check that he couldn't cash. And now he was the father of a hedgehog monster. The farmer and his wife weren't prone to hysterics. They were not theatrical people. The couple put the absurdity of the situation aside and they got down to practicalities. The boy must be christened, but we'll never find a godfather for him, said the farmer. The farmer's wife replied, there's only one name I can think for him. That's Hans my Hedgehog. So with the name decided, the little family visited a surprised pastor who opted not to ask any questions about the hedgehog. In these types of situations, the pastor often felt the best course of action was to act serious and keep his mouth closed. After the christening, the pastor, the farmer, and his wife looked down on the half-hedgehog boy in silence. No one really knew what to say, but the pastor finally said, he won't be able to sleep in a regular bed because of his quills. And then the couple took Hans home. They laid straw behind the stove and put Hans in the nest on the floor.
Okay, so far I love being told a story.
I never get to tell you stories, but I always want to like read to you at night.
All you do is tell me stories for this podcast.
I mean like a soothing story.
This is not that soothing yet. I love how
it's going to be way less soothing as we go along.
I love how the priest was like, just like breaking the silence. Where's he going to sleep?
To me, it just sounds like he's like, I don't know what else to say.
Yeah, right.
I'll just say, I don't think he can sleep in a normal bed. He'd be tearing up the sheets and stuff, right?
And also, at this point, Hans is an infant, right?
Yeah, he's a baby.
Okay.
And our story continues. Because Hans my Hedgehog was indeed, as we established, covered in quills, breastfeeding proved to be pretty much impossible. So, unsure of what to do next, the farmer and his wife just left Hans behind the stove in his straw nest for the next 8 years. Around the year 8 mark, the farmer started wishing Hans would just die. But guess what? Hans didn't die. He just reclined in his tiny straw nest and he thought about life. One day, there came an opportunity for the farmer to let down his hair. A fair came to the village. And although he might receive a solid teasing from the other farmers, the farmer decided, whatever, dude, I'm going to this fair and I'm going to have a little fun. The farmer went around his house taking requests for gifts. He wants to hype everybody up. His practical wife said she wanted meat and rolls for the house. His maid, excited to get a gift from the fair, she asked for a pair of slippers and socks embroidered with little illustrations of clocks.
Oh, so the maid wants fancy clothes. The wife is like, I don't know, just get us something.
Meat and bread. And finally, the farmer went behind the stove to ask Hans my Hedgehog what he would like from the fair. Because even after all the farmer's death wishes, Hans was still alive. And after all, Hans was still his son. Hans looked up at his father with his little hedgehog face and said, "Father, just bring me some bagpipes."
Some bagpipes?
This story has so many twists, you will not believe it.
I also thought you were going to say, Hans looked up at his father with his little hedgehog face and said, or whatever hedgehogs sound like.
So the farmer went to the fair. He didn't engage with the haters. He got his shopping on, and he returned to the farm with meat, rolls, slippers, socks with clocks, and a fine set of bagpipes. When the farmer squatted down behind the stove to hand Hans my Hedgehog his bagpipes, his tiny son was very serious. Hans looked up from his nest of straw in the shadows and said, "Father, please go to the blacksmith and have him shoe my rooster. Then I'll ride away and never come back." The farmer was very excited. It had been a long 8 years with a half hedgehog son. 8 years of teasing, 8 years of stormy looks from his wife, 8 years of awkward meals punctuated with Hans quietly snuffling down his bread and sausages from behind the stove. Now, this cruel cosmic joke was finally over. Giddily, the farmer took Hans's rooster to the blacksmith to have it properly outfitted with traveling shoes.
Is that really a blacksmith operation?
Apparently, yeah, man. Blacksmiths, they do horses, but if you're a tiny hedgehog,
Yeah.
then you can't ride a horse that's too big. You got to ride a rooster.
And the blacksmith is like, okay, another magical small creature needs to get around on an animal. I do know how to make the proper shoes and saddle for that.
Exactly. Blacksmith's blacksmith. Don't even worry about it, man.
Yeah.
Practical.
Okay.
Meanwhile, Hans my Hedgehog collected a few of his father's pigs and donkeys together to take with him out into the forest. He's got to make a living, right? When the rooster was good to go, Hans mounted it and took off down the road with his pigs and donkeys to live a solitary life deep within the forest, promising his parents never to return again.
Did he bring his bagpipes with him?
Oh, yeah, he did. As the farmer and his wife watched their tiny son atop his rooster playing his bagpipes over the horizon, they were struck by how Hans had become even weirder than he already was. Okay, when Hans my Hedgehog and his animal entourage reached the heart of the dense forest, Hans spurred his rooster to fly him up into a tall tree. There, he played beautiful songs on the bagpipe and tended to his herd of donkeys and pigs for many, many years until Hans was no longer a boy. He was a solid musician and a tiny hedgehog man. One day, deep in the dense forest, a king appeared. The king was riding a majestic horse and accompanied by servants. This imperious and royal party was hopelessly lost, snagged in a thicket, frustrated, his fine robes all messed up and caught on sticks and branches. The king stumbled upon a strange scene. A huge, healthy herd of pigs and donkeys living in harmony and accompanied by heavenly bagpipe music. But eerily, the owner of the flock and player of the bagpipes was nowhere to be seen. Now remember, this is definitely the time, like around the time when witches and sorcerers were real. So who knows what was up with this weird scene, right? Like, approach with caution. So flustered, the king commanded his servants, like, well, go find this musician. We need to find this musician, see if he can help us out of the woods. Braving the possibility of angering a crazy wizard or something, one of the nervous servants wandered around the forest amongst the pigs and donkeys, essentially basically looking for trouble. You know, he's like, I'm gonna die. Eventually, he spotted Hans my Hedgehog chilling high up in a tree, sitting on a rooster, going off on the bagpipes. And from the forest floor, Hans, combined with a rooster and some bagpipes, looked even more exotic than a hedgehog man. So the servant opted not to say anything, and instead he ran back to where the king and his party were waiting to tell them all about the terrifying creature in the tree. I don't know about the musician, but there's this terrifying guy up in the tree. It looks like all the things combined are a new kind of creature. You know, he's lost his mind.
In the drawings for this story, are the human legs super muscular?
They're defined.
I could definitely imagine just like a soft, cuddly hedgehog with big, massive, like He-Man style muscle legs.
I love that. No, they're kind of more delicate than that, but I think that your imagination is valid.
Thank you.
Okay, so the king was like, well, I'm not going to go talk to that guy, right? And the king was tired, freaked out, totally over the woods. So he commanded his servant to go back to the creature and asked him how to get out of these godforsaken woods and back to his kingdom. Hans my Hedgehog was pretty cool about the whole thing. He climbed down the tree on his tiny man legs and confidently walked straight up to the king. Hans had some leverage here, right? He was confident and sure of himself, while the king and his party were a little knocked off their axis. You know, what's going on here? So Hans told the king, yeah, sure, I will show you the way back to your castle. But in exchange, the king would have to promise in writing to give Hans the first thing Hans saw in the king's courtyard. Okay?
Okay. That's a pretty big gamble on Hans's part. What if the first thing he sees is something that's kind of weak?
Like a broom. That's the first thing I thought.
Yeah. I want the first thing valuable that I see in your
Didn't
courtyard.
say it. He says, Hans, you know, we'll see this as the story progresses.
Yeah.
He doesn't suffer fools. You know, he says, you know what I mean.
Right.
Right? I'm not going to take a broom.
Yeah.
You know what I mean.
Gotcha.
So the king takes this all in, and he thinks to himself, I'm 100% sure this hedgehog can't read.
That's a bad stereotype against hedgehogs.
Well, that's what he thought. He said, I'm 100%, I'm 100% sure this hedgehog guy can't read. So the king decides to kind of pull a Hail Mary. He royally pulls out a royal quill, has someone grab an ink pot. He pulls out a scroll, and with a flourish, he just wrote out a bunch of gibberish in cursive, right? And he's like, here you go, man. And then the party was on its way back to the castle with Hans leading the way.
So he wrote a fake contract agreeing to nothing.
Yeah, he said, "Oh, yes, sir, absolutely." But it was just all scrolls and gibberish. And Hans looked at it. He said, "That looks good to me." Rolled it up, and they head back to the castle.
Okay.
So after some time, they finally reached the castle. From the towers and battlements, the king's people rejoiced. Crowds of subjects hurried out of the castle to greet their long overdue king. And at the head of the crowd was the king's daughter. Hans hung back, his little hedgehog eyes trained on the courtyard. As the quickly running princess broke away from the pack and was the first to run across the courtyard and into her father's arms, Hans was satisfied. With his daughter in his arms, the king turned his head over his shoulder, just in time to lock eyes with the hedgehog man on Roosterback at the edge of the forest.
Who would be his new son-in-law.
Knowing his deal was secure, sealed with a contract written in fabulous cursive, Hans turned around and rode his rooster back to the forest. Hans was playing a long game, but he'd be back. After Hans left, the king pulled the princess aside to tell her the deal. In exchange for directions home, he'd promised to give Hans my Hedgehog the first thing he saw in the courtyard. But the king told the princess not to worry. This hedgehog was tripping. He couldn't read, and the contract was fake anyway, so no one would hold him to it. And like father, like daughter, the princess responded, "Great, fine. I'm glad you're home, Dad, but regardless of any contract, I will not be marrying a hedgehog."
Also, for all the children at home, human beings are not things.
Thank you.
So in that way, also, she shouldn't be the quote-unquote thing that he saw.
Yes. Thank you, Nick. I appreciate it.
That's what I'm here for.
Meanwhile, Hans happily returned to his spot in the forest to tend his pigs and donkeys and play his bagpipes with joy. So, as powerful as they were, it seems that kings in the story were not very good with directions. And a short time later, another lost king with his entourage stumbled upon Hans and his whole scene.
So kings are always getting lost.
They are getting lost. Again, this king was too freaked to approach Hans himself, doesn't know what's going on. Who knows what a hedgehog man would do if you interrupted his bagpipe playing? Maybe he can shoot lasers out of his eyes or turn the king into a turkey leg, right? Nobody knows.
Right. Wait, hold on. Was being turned into a turkey leg an actual fear? Or did you just
it's a fear of
that?
mine. I'm just saying, like, wild card, right?
I would be scared that they would turn into a big hedgehog and then be able to eat me.
Oh, that's also valid fear.
Yeah.
So, because of all this, the king again sends his servant to go ask Hans my Hedgehog for directions. And the servant cautiously strolled over and sort of opened with like, "Hey man, what are you doing up in that tree?" Like he didn't really ask.
"Excuse me, Mr. Hedgehog, sir. Sorry to bother you."
Hans pleasantly replied, "I'm tending my donkeys and pigs, but what can I do for you?" The servant spilled the beans. He and his royal party were horribly lost, and they had been for some time. They were in desperate need of directions. Hans climbed down his tree, walked over to the king on his little human legs, and told the old king and his party the same deal. "I'll bring you home if you put in writing that I can have the first thing I see in your courtyard." This time, the king is cool. And he actually writes the contract straight up. No tricks. So Hans revved up the bagpipes and led the party out of the woods and back to their castle. Now, these guys had been lost in the woods for a minute. And when they approached the castle, everyone was really pumped up. It was a huge deal. The king was very loved. Bells were ringing. People were shouting and running to greet the party. And again, the king's only daughter, a beautiful princess, ran out of the castle ahead of the pack to greet her father. Again, the first thing Hans saw in the courtyard was the beautiful princess. Everyone saw it happen. And, secure in his contract, Hans rode his rooster back to the forest, planning to collect his princess later. Now, this time, the old king took a different tactic. He talked up Hans to his daughter. He said, "Oh, we met this amazing creature. He can play the bagpipes. He has this amazing herd of animals. And oh, girl, he is so polite. He may have been a tiny half hedgehog man, but he saved my life." But here's the thing. In exchange for directions home, I had to give him the first thing he saw in my courtyard. And my dear girl, that would be you. So this princess was grateful to Hans and loyal to her father and his promises. So she promised to honor the contract and then began to mentally prepare to marry a hedgehog.
How would you do that?
Just meditation. That's what we've learned from years of therapy. Back in the forest, Hans had grown his herd so big, the entire forest was filled with healthy, fat pigs and donkeys. Absolute madness. The biggest herd you've ever seen.
Right, because he said, "Hey, Dad, okay, I'll leave, but I need this way to make money. I need a farm. I need animals." But then he just goes and lives alone in the forest, and he's a hedgehog, so he can just eat grass or whatever. So he's not selling or, eating any of the animals he's growing.
He's growing his wealth.
Right.
Yeah.
Invest in yourself, kids. That's the moral there.
And by this time, Hans my Hedgehog was done with the forest life. Tired of living alone, he owned 2 princesses, and it was time to collect. But first, he had some business to attend to. Hans sent a message to his father to clear out all the pigsties in the entire village. Hans was coming to town with a boatload of pigs, and anyone who wanted one could pick theirs to slaughter. So the farmer got the message, and he was stressing. He hated being teased. It had been so many years. Most people had forgot about his hedgehog boy, and the farmer thought it's been so many years, he thought his son would be dead by now. He's like, I didn't know this would come back to haunt me. But the farmer had underestimated his boy. Hans my Hedgehog was about to fill the entire village with pigs, and sausage is better than teasing.
I have a question.
What, Nicholas?
Is Hans's plan to sell the pigs and sausages or just give them away?
Looks like you're going to have to wait and find out.
Okay.
Like the ultimate big boss, Hans drove his herd of pigs into the village, and from his perch atop his rooster, he commanded the pigs to be slaughtered. And there was such a bloodbath of slaughtering and butchering, the squealing of pigs could be heard for miles.
That's horrifying. It's terrible.
After the mass pig slaughtering was over, Hans asked his father to have the blacksmith shoe his rooster again, and the farmer enthusiastically complied. Even though Hans had fed the village several times over with pigs, the farmer was again squirming with embarrassment. He was not a brave man. He wanted his rooster-riding half-hedgehog son out of here. No more teasing. He couldn't stand it. So, after his rooster was ready, Hans again promised his dad he would never return to the village as long as he lived. And the farmer was relieved. Hans was tired of the woods. He was ready to live his best life, and his first stop on that journey was to pick up his first princess. But Hans was in for a battle, because as we all know, that first king was super shady. He told all his men to use spears and swords to stop anyone riding a rooster and playing the bagpipes from entering the castle. So, when Hans my Hedgehog came riding over the hill, blasting his bagpipes, he struck fear into the hearts of men. The guards tried to stab the tiny man with a bayonet, but he spurred his rooster, who flew through the air and over the guards, landing on the king's window ledge.
Man, that's a really powerful rooster.
Yep. Hans my Hedgehog wasn't playing any games. He didn't care about the fake contract. He didn't care if he was illiterate. He was there to take his princess or murder both the king and his daughter, whichever.
Whoa, so Hans went from I'm a peaceful little forest dweller to I'm getting what's mine, and heads will roll if I don't get it.
He's a very, very powerful dude, okay?
Yeah.
In terror, cowering on the floor, the king knew he had made a big mistake. He had messed around and found out. The king commanded his daughter to go with the hedgehog man. The princess was hastily dressed in white bridal robes and loaded up in a carriage filled with dowry money and servants and everything, fruit, nuts, whatever, and was hurried out of the kingdom like, go, get out of here with the hedgehog. The procession left the palace, followed by Hans, triumphant with his rooster and bagpipes. But Hans, the spite hog, wasn't done. Just outside the border of the kingdom, Hans had the procession pull over. He dismounted his rooster and stalked over to the carriage carrying the princess. Little Hans climbed into the carriage to face his reluctant bride. He screamed in his tiny voice, "This is what you get for being so deceitful!" And he stabbed her all over with his hedgehog quills until she was bloody. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "Go back home. I don't want you." And then he sent the procession and all the money back to the palace and to the cowering king, where the princess apparently lived disgraced for the rest of her life.
That is so brutal and mean and makes no sense. That's all the things in one. It's almost scarier because it's just like, what? And can you imagine he's a little hedgehog, so he has to stab her with his back?
Wait, what happens next?
Oh, no.
Hot off his rampage, Hans the Hedgehog Man headed off to collect on his second contract, rage playing his bagpipes along the way. When Hans my Hedgehog approached the wall of the second kingdom on Roosterback, he was met again with a wall of guards. But this time, the air filled with men shouting, "Long may he live!" and the clanging of guards throwing their weapons against the ground. Hans proudly rode his rooster through the palace gates. Now, not to sugarcoat it, Princess number 2 was totally freaked out by the situation. But she didn't put up a fight, and the two were married in a royal ceremony. So it's like every other wedding, right? Eating, dancing, partying, and then the wedding night. When it was time for Hans and the princess to spend their first night as hedgehog man and wife together, there were some negotiations. The princess was afraid of Hans' sharp quills, but Hans promised he wouldn't spike her because Hans wasn't quite done blowing the world's mind. Hans went to the old king with a set of instructions. He was to send 4 men to stand guard in front of the bridal suite and make a big fire. He told the king when he prepared himself for bed that night, he would slip off his hedgehog skin. As soon as he did, the men would have to run in as fast as they could, grab the bloody skin, throw it into the fire, and stand there until the entire skin was burned to ashes. So this is how it all went down. The princess went to bed in their marital room. 4 guards built up a raging fire outside their bedroom. At exactly 11 p.m., Hans my Hedgehog entered the room, ripped off his hedgehog skin, and climbed into bed with the princess, skinless.
And bloody gross.
The men ran in at breakneck speed, grabbed the hedgehog skin, and threw it into the fire. When the skin was completely burned to ashes, Hans my Hedgehog turned into a normal-sized man. Mm-hmm. But he was black and charred to a crisp. So then the king's doctor rushed into the bedchamber and rubbed Hans all over his naked body with lotion. The princess hanging nearby didn't know what was going on, but definitely tried to play it cool. Gradually, the ashes and char came off, and Hans turned into a surprisingly handsome young man. After all the madness, the fire and ashes, the hordes of guards, the rubbing of royal lotions, the princess and Hans were finally left alone to get to know each other. The next morning, Hans and the princess had breakfast together, and then another marriage ceremony, this time with Hans as a human being who would inherit a kingdom. A few years later, Hans and his wife decided to visit his hometown, despite his promises to his father that he'd never return. Mm-hmm. When the farmer answered his door to a handsome, smiling couple, he was confused but congenial. Hans told his father, "It's me, Dad, your son." The farmer says, "No, my son is a hedgehog." Hans is like, "No, Dad, I'm Hans." And the farmer, now an old man, was finally not at all embarrassed. He rejoiced and followed Hans back to his kingdom, apparently leaving his wife behind. Either that or she was dead. The end. I read a little bit about the themes and motifs of this story. Mm-hmm. And the thing that stood out for me is this is a figure who defies pity.
Oh, interesting.
You're going to think, oh, he's a little hedgehog man.
Yeah.
Oh, he's got this problem. And his parents are embarrassed of him and he's a failure.
Yeah.
He lives in a nest behind a stove.
Right.
He has all these things that would make him a sympathetic character. But he lives his life
like a villain.
Or maybe a guy who's just, amoral, right? Mm-hmm. He's just living his life. He doesn't care what you think is good, what you think is bad. He said, listen, nobody taught me. I didn't go to school. I live behind a stove. I don't know how to read. I'm just going to be like, I don't know. These are my terms of living my life. Give me a contract.
Yeah.
And if you don't fulfill it, I'll bring shame and violence upon your house. I mean, and for no reason, I'll give you a bunch of sausage, except for maybe to be like, hey, Dad, look,
right,
I did this thing for you. And he's like, still don't like you.
Yeah.
No worries, Dad. I'll make you proud someday. He's got his own set of stuff and he's just doing it. He's like our cat.
Yeah, exactly. But I also don't think he did it to get his father's approval.
I love it. Fine. Great.
He
just did it to flex on everyone.
That's right. Okay, children. Hans my Hedgehog is not a hero, but we can still learn something from his weird, spiteful, anti-pity ways.
Yes. Good.
Thank you so much for listening. If you have a loved one in your life who might enjoy these Muriel's Grimm episodes, please play it for them. Text it to them. Post about these episodes online or share them in whatever way feels best for you. Thank you very much for sharing the love. This episode was written and performed by Muriel Montgomery, and all the recording, editing, and sound effects were engineered by me, Nick Castellini. It was recorded in our living room, and all the music was royalty-free. Thank you to all the amazing musicians.
If you're new to our podcast or a longtime listener and you enjoyed these Muriel's Grimm episodes, please let us know. If these are a hit with you or the kids in your life, we would love to hear from you.
Our contact information is in the show notes of this episode. Our regular scheduled true crime programming will be back to normal next week.
Thank you. Sweet dreams and good night.